In the last episode, we revealed the invisible war between two superpowers. We talked about four pillars of power. Today, we dive deep into the first pillar, the one that's quietly reshaping the entire world while you sleep. This is the story of how China bought the planet. Not with armies, not with bombs, but with concrete, steel, and debt. And by the time you finish watching this, you'll understand why your children might be paying rent to Beijing. Let me take you to a place most Americans have never heard of, a port city on the edge of Europe, Piraeus, Greece. In 2008, Greece was drowning. The financial crisis had destroyed their economy. Unemployment hit 27%. The government was desperate for cash, anything to stay afloat. And that's when China arrived. Not with a rescue package, not with aid, but with an offer. The China Ocean Shipping Company, COSCO, one of the largest state-owned enterprises in the world, approached the Greek government with a deal. Sell us your port, they said. We'll turn it into something great. The Greeks had no choice. In 2016, they sold a controlling stake, 67%, of the port of Piraeus to China for 368 million euros. It seemed like a lifeline, a way out of the abyss. But here's what nobody understood at the time. China wasn't buying a port, they were buying a gateway into Europe. Fast forward to today. The port of Piraeus is now the busiest port in the Mediterranean, the fourth busiest in all of Europe. Over 5 million containers move through it every year. Chinese goods flooding into European markets. Electronics, textiles, machinery, everything. But here's the catch. China doesn't just own the infrastructure. They control the flow of goods. When a Chinese cargo ship docks in Piraeus, it docks in a Chinese-controlled port on European soil. The European Union tries to regulate trade, but the physical infrastructure, the docks, the cranes, the logistics, belongs to Beijing. This is the new colonialism. Not soldiers, not flags, just ownership. And Piraeus is just the beginning. Let's talk about a country most people can't even find on a map. Sri Lanka, a small island nation off the coast of India. Beautiful beaches, ancient temples, and a government desperate to modernize. In 2007, Sri Lanka's president had a vision. He wanted to build a massive port in Hambantota, a small town on the southern coast. A port that would rival Singapore, a port that would transform Sri Lanka into a global shipping hub. There was just one problem. Sri Lanka didn't have the money. Western banks wouldn't lend. The World Bank said the project wasn't economically viable. The numbers didn't make sense. But China said yes. China offered Sri Lanka over $1 billion in loans to build the Hambantota port. High interest rates. But Sri Lanka didn't care. They needed the investment. They needed to believe in something. Construction began in 2008. Chinese companies built it. Chinese workers operated the cranes. Chinese engineers designed the logistics. And when it was finished in 2010, it was a marvel. A state-of-the-art deep-water port capable of handling the world's largest cargo ships. But nobody came. The port sat empty. Month after month, year after year. Ships didn't dock. The revenue projections were fantasies. Hambantota became a ghost port, a billion-dollar monument to a dream that never materialized. And then the debt came due. Sri Lanka couldn't pay. The interest piled up. The government scrambled for cash. They tried refinancing. They tried negotiating. But China had them cornered. In 2017, Sri Lanka made a decision that would haunt them for generations. They handed over the port to China. Not just operational control, ownership, a 99-year lease. China now owns a strategic deep-water port on one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. This is what they call a debt trap. Loan a country money they can't repay, wait for them to default, then take the asset. And it's happening everywhere. In Djibouti, China controls the Dorala container terminal and built their first overseas military base. The country now owes China over 80% of its GDP. In Pakistan, China invested $62 billion in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, including control of Gwadar Port. Pakistan's debt to China has exploded. In Kenya, China financed a railway from Nairobi to Mombasa for over $3 billion. Kenya is now struggling to repay, and rumors swirl that the port of Mombasa could be next. This is the Belt and Road Initiative in action. It sounds benign. Infrastructure development. economic cooperation, win-win partnerships. But the reality is darker. It's a strategy of economic colonization, and it's working. Now let's talk about America, the country that built the interstate highway system, the country that constructed the Hoover Dam, the country that once led the world in infrastructure innovation. In episode 1, we talked about the invisible war between the United States and China. We broke down the 4 pillars of modern power: infrastructure, technology, currency, and information. Today, we're going deep into the first pillar, the one that started it all, the one most people still don't understand: infrastructure. Because here's what they're not telling you. While America argues about potholes and crumbling bridges, China has quietly bought half the world. Not with missiles, not with invasions, with concrete, steel, and debt. This is the story of the greatest economic conquest in human history. A conquest so subtle, so slow, that most people don't even realize it's happening. By the end of this episode, you'll see the world differently. You'll understand why that Chinese-owned port in Greece matters more than any aircraft carrier, why a railway in Kenya is more powerful than a military base, and why America, the nation that built the modern world with infrastructure, is losing the very game it invented. This is episode 2, the infrastructure empire. Let's go back to 2013, Beijing, China. President Xi Jinping stands before a crowd and announces something the Western world barely notices: the Belt and Road Initiative. On paper, it sounds benign. China will invest in infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, and Africa. Roads, railways, ports, power plants. They'll connect the ancient Silk Road routes with modern technology. They'll lift developing nations out of poverty. The West shrugs. Let them waste their money, officials in Washington say. Infrastructure is expensive, slow, and politically messy. Good luck with that. But China wasn't wasting money. They were buying the future. Here's how it works. It's brilliant, it's ruthless, and it's devastatingly effective. Step 1. Identify a struggling country, preferably one with strategic value: a deep water port, proximity to trade routes, natural resources, or political influence in a region. Step 2. Offer them a deal they can't refuse. We'll build you a modern port, a new highway system, a railway that connects your landlocked capital to the ocean, and we'll finance the entire thing. Low interest rates, friendly terms. You don't have to pay us back for 10, 15, even 20 years. What government says no to that? What politician turns down the chance to cut a ribbon at a gleaming new infrastructure project funded by someone else's money? Step 3. This is where it gets interesting. China doesn't just loan the money. Chinese state-owned companies do the construction. Chinese workers fill most of the jobs. Chinese materials, steel, concrete, equipment, get shipped in. So that loan, a huge portion of it flows right back into the Chinese economy. Step 4. Wait. Because here's the thing about infrastructure projects in developing nations. They almost never generate the revenue projections promised. That shiny new port, it doesn't attract as much shipping as expected. That railway, operating costs are higher than anticipated. That highway, toll revenue falls short, and suddenly, 5-10 years later, that friendly loan becomes a crushing debt burden. Step 5. The conversion. When the country can't repay, China doesn't demand cash. They don't send in debt collectors. They do something far more valuable. They take equity, control, ownership. Can't pay back the loan for that port? No problem. Sign it over to us. We'll run it for the next 99 years. And just like that, China owns critical infrastructure in a foreign country. Legally, peacefully, permanently. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation. This is happening right now in dozens of countries on every inhabited continent except North America. Let me show you exactly how this works. Let's start in Europe, in a place most Americans have never heard of: Piraeus, an ancient port city in Greece, just a few miles from Athens. For thousands of years, it's been one of the Mediterranean's most important harbors. But by 2008, it was struggling. Outdated equipment, inefficient operations, labor strikes, Greece itself was drowning in debt after the financial crisis. China saw an opportunity. In 2010, COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, leased part of the port, just a small section at first, a trial run. They promised to modernize operations, increase efficiency, bring in more business. The Greeks were skeptical. The port workers were hostile. Unions protested. "This is our port," they said, "our heritage. We don't want Chinese control." But China was patient. They invested. They upgraded cranes, expanded container capacity, streamlined logistics, and slowly things began to change. By 2016, Piraeus had become the fastest growing port in Europe. Shipping traffic exploded. Jobs increased. Revenue soared. The Greek government, desperate for cash and economic success stories, agreed to sell COSCO a majority stake, 67% ownership, for 368.5 million euros. Today, Piraeus is the fourth busiest port in Europe. It's the primary gateway for Chinese goods entering the continent, and China owns it. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just about shipping containers. It's about strategic control. Piraeus sits at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Every Chinese product that flows through that port, electronics, machinery, textiles, everything, strengthens China's economic position in Europe. Every European company that uses that port to export goods becomes dependent on Chinese infrastructure. And here's the kicker. Greece is a member of the European Union and NATO. So now, inside the Western Alliance, at the heart of Europe, China controls a critical piece of infrastructure. When the EU tries to pass resolutions criticizing China's human rights record, guess which country often blocks or waters them down? Greece, because they can't afford to upset their biggest investor. This is infrastructure as geopolitical leverage, and Piraeus is just the beginning. Let's go further. Let's go to a small island nation in the Indian Ocean, where China pulled off one of the most brazen infrastructure takeovers in modern history, Sri Lanka. A beautiful island nation south of India, 22 million people, a developing economy, and in the early 2000s, a government with big ambitions. President Mahinda Rajapaksa wanted to transform his country. He wanted modern infrastructure, economic growth, international prestige, and China was more than happy to help. In 2007, China offered to finance and build a massive deep-water port in Hambantota, a small town on Sri Lanka's southern coast. The project would cost over $1 billion. Sri Lankan officials raised concerns. Hambantota was remote, lightly populated, far from major shipping lanes. The projections didn't make economic sense, but Rajapaksa pushed forward. The Chinese loans were too attractive. The political optics were too good. Construction began. By 2010, the port opened. It was state-of-the-art. Modern cranes, deep berths capable of handling the world's largest ships, a gleaming symbol of Sri Lanka's progress. There was just one problem. Nobody used it. Shipping companies didn't divert their routes to Hambantota. The port sat largely empty. Revenue projections collapsed. Instead of generating the income needed to repay the Chinese loans, Hambantota became a financial black hole. By 2016, Sri Lanka owed China over $8 billion in infrastructure loans. The interest payments alone were crippling the national budget. The country was spiraling toward default. China made an offer. "We'll forgive some of the debt, but in exchange, you sign over the Hambantota port to us. We'll lease it for 99 years. We'll run it. We'll control it." Sri Lanka had no choice. In 2017, they handed over 70% ownership of Hambantota Port to China Merchants Port Holdings. For 99 years, think about that. 99 years. By the time that lease expires, everyone reading this will be dead. That's not a lease. That's a transfer of sovereignty. And it gets worse. Because Hambantota isn't just a commercial port. It sits along one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, the route that connects the Middle East's oil fields to East Asia's economies. It's also just a few hundred miles from India, China's primary regional rival. Since taking over, China has expanded Hambantota's capabilities. They've built fuel storage facilities. They've upgraded the infrastructure to accommodate not just cargo ships, but larger vessels. Military vessels. China officially says Hambantota will never be a military base, but infrastructure is dual use. A port that can handle large commercial ships can handle naval vessels. A fuel depot that serves cargo fleets can refuel warships. India is terrified. They call it the String of Pearls, a network of Chinese-controlled ports encircling the Indian Ocean. Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Chittagong in Bangladesh, Kyaukphyu in Myanmar, every one of them financed, built, and controlled by China. This is what debt trap diplomacy looks like. And it's not just happening in Asia. Let's go to Africa, where China has executed the same playbook on an even larger scale. Kenya, East Africa, a nation of 54 million people with one major problem. Their economy is landlocked from their interior regions. The capital, Nairobi, sits inland. The only major port, Mombasa, is on the coast. And the connection between them, a century-old railway built by the British, was collapsing. In 2014, Kenya signed a deal with China. China would finance and build a modern railway connecting Mombasa to Nairobi. The price tag, $3.2 billion. It would be East Africa's largest infrastructure project since independence. Construction moved fast. Chinese companies brought in workers, equipment, materials. By 2017, the railway was operational. It was sleek, fast, modern, a point of national pride. But let's look at the details, because this is where the playbook reveals itself. First, the cost. The Mombasa-Nairobi Railway cost $3.2 billion for just 300 miles of track. That's over $10 million per mile. By comparison, high-speed rail in Europe costs around $25 million per mile, and that's high speed, not standard gauge. China charged Kenya a premium and financed it with high-interest loans. Second, the jobs. Kenya was promised that locals would fill most positions. In reality, Chinese workers dominated the construction and now run the operations. The technology is Chinese. The expertise is Chinese. Kenya didn't gain skills or capacity. They gained debt and dependence. Third, the profitability. The railway was supposed to pay for itself through ticket and freight revenue. It hasn't. Not even close. Operating costs exceed revenue. Kenya is bleeding money every year trying to keep it running while simultaneously servicing the debt. Fourth, the terms. If Kenya defaults, and analysts say it's increasingly likely, guess what happens? China can seize the railway. And not just the railway. The contracts include clauses that allow China to claim other national assets, including the port of Mombasa. Imagine that. Kenya's only major port, its economic lifeline, handed over to China because they couldn't repay a railway loan. This isn't isolated. China built a railway from Djibouti to Ethiopia. Djibouti now owes China $1.4 billion, more than 80% of its GDP. They built rail lines in Angola, Nigeria, Tanzania. Every one of them financed by Chinese loans. Every one of them operated by Chinese companies. Every one of them a potential asset seizure waiting to happen. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa? Paid for and built by China. In 2018, it was revealed that the building's IT systems were sending data back to Chinese servers every night. China had bugged the entire building. This is infrastructure imperialism, but it's imperialism without the word empire, without soldiers or occupations. It's quieter, cleaner, and in some ways, more effective than anything the old colonial powers ever managed. Now let's contrast this with America. Let's look at what the United States has been doing while China built an empire. California, 2008. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger announces a bold vision. California will build a high-speed rail system connecting Los Angeles to San Francisco. It will be America's first true high-speed rail. Travel time, under 3 hours. Cost, $33 billion. Completion date, 2020. It's supposed to be America's answer to Europe's rail networks, to Japan's bullet trains, to China's expanding system, a symbol that the United States can still build great things. Fast forward to 2025. Not a single passenger has ridden the train, not one. The cost has exploded to over $128 billion, nearly 4 times the original estimate. The completion date has been pushed to 2033, and even that's optimistic. Many analysts now believe the project will never be completed. What went wrong? Everything. Environmental reviews took years. Every tiny segment of track required separate studies, assessments, public comment periods. Endangered species, wetlands, historical sites, the regulatory maze was endless. Land acquisition became a nightmare. Thousands of property owners fought eminent domain claims in court. Legal battles dragged on for years, driving costs through the roof. Labor disputes erupted. Union requirements mandated specific wages, specific hiring practices, specific working conditions. Every contractor had to navigate a maze of regulations that added time and expense. Political interference was constant. Every election cycle brought new administrations with new priorities. Funding got redirected, plans got revised, leadership changed. Nobody owned the vision long enough to see it through. And here's the most painful comparison. While California has been struggling with 520 miles of track for 17 years, China has built over 27,000 miles of high-speed rail in the same time frame. 27,000 miles. China didn't build one line. They built an entire network that connects virtually every major city in the country. They did it faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than anything the West has managed in the 21st century. How? Simple. When the Chinese government decides to build infrastructure, it happens. Environmental concerns? Overruled. Property owners in the way? Relocated. Labor disputes? Non-existent in a system where the state controls unions? Political opposition? Irrelevant. I'm not saying we should copy China's authoritarian model, but we need to recognize the reality. America's system of checks, balances, regulations, and democratic processes, designed to protect rights and ensure accountability, has created an infrastructure paralysis. We can't build anymore. Not quickly, not efficiently, not at scale. And while we argue about process, China builds. They build ports. They build railways. They build power plants and 5G networks and smart cities. They build the physical infrastructure of the 21st century economy. And here's what that means. Infrastructure isn't just about transportation or convenience. It's about economic velocity. It's about how fast goods, people, and information move through a system. Every hour a truck sits in traffic on a crumbling American highway, China gains a competitive advantage. Every delayed shipment due to port congestion, China gains ground. Every business that looks at infrastructure quality when deciding where to expand and chooses Shanghai over San Francisco, that's a loss we'll never recover. But the infrastructure empire isn't just about what China is building. It's about the world they're building, the system they're creating. Let me show you what the map looks like in 2030 if this trajectory continues. It's 2030. Let's look at a map of the world, but not the political map you're used to. This is the infrastructure control map. Start in Europe. Piraeus in Greece, Chinese-controlled. The port of Valencia in Spain, major Chinese investment. Rotterdam in the Netherlands, significant Chinese stake. Across the continent, Chinese companies own or control pieces of critical ports, railways, and telecommunications networks. Move to Africa. Virtually every major port on the continent has Chinese involvement. Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, Djibouti. Chinese companies run the cranes, manage the logistics, control the data. The railways connecting interior capitals to coastal ports? Chinese built, Chinese operated, Chinese owned. Swing through the Middle East. The port of Haifa in Israel, operated by a Chinese company. Khalifa Port in the UAE, significant Chinese investment. Even in America's traditional sphere of influence, China has a foothold. Head to South America. Chinese companies control or have stakes in ports in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru. The Panama Canal, still owned by Panama, but Chinese companies operate terminals at both ends. Cross the Pacific to Southeast Asia. Cambodia's Sihanoukville, effectively a Chinese colony. The port of Laem Chabang in Thailand. Major Chinese involvement. Infrastructure across Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, everywhere. Chinese loans, Chinese companies, Chinese control. Now look at the United States. Our ports are old, congested, struggling with supply chain issues, Our railways move freight slower than they did in the 1960s. Our highways are crumbling. Our airports are outdated. We haven't built a major new piece of infrastructure in decades. But it's not just about what we haven't built. It's about what we're losing, because here's the endgame. The country that controls global infrastructure controls global trade, and the country that controls global trade controls the global economy. When Chinese companies run the ports, they see the data. They know what's being shipped, where it's going, who's buying it. That's economic intelligence gathering at scale. When Chinese companies build the 5G networks, they control the digital infrastructure. They can monitor communications, influence what data flows where, potentially shut down networks in a crisis. When Chinese companies own the railways, the ports, the power plants, they own leverage. They can slow down an economy with a labor dispute. They can disrupt supply chains with an operational issue. They can extract political concessions by threatening to withdraw services. This is the infrastructure empire, not built through conquest, but through investment, not maintained by garrisons, but by contracts and debt. It's an empire where the colonized nations invited their colonizers in, signed the papers themselves, and didn't realize what they'd given away until it was too late. And America is watching it happen, paralyzed by political gridlock, regulatory red tape, and a fundamental failure to understand that infrastructure is power. So here's where we are. China has spent the last 15 years building an infrastructure empire that spans the globe. They've done it with patience, with planning, with a clear strategic vision. They've turned ports into pressure points, railways into control mechanisms, debt into leverage. And the West, led by the United States, has stood by and let it happen. We told ourselves infrastructure doesn't matter. We told ourselves it's too expensive, too slow, too complicated. We told ourselves the free market would sort it out. We were wrong, because infrastructure is the foundation of everything. It's how goods move, how people travel, how information flows, how economies function. And right now, China is building that foundation and writing the rules and positioning themselves to control the global economy for the next century. But here's the thing about infrastructure. It's not too late. It's never too late to build. The question is whether America has the will, the vision, and the political courage to do what's necessary. Because in the next episode, we're going even deeper. We're going to talk about the one industry that matters more than any other. The one technology that sits at the heart of every modern economy. The one resource that China will do anything, including start a war, to control. Semiconductors, microchips, and the island that makes them, Taiwan. Episode 3, The Chip War, coming soon. The infrastructure empire is just the beginning.